Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Ben Yanis on the show for the first time. For those that don't know Ben, he is a biomechanics nerd. He has grown his social media following on Instagram to over 700,000 followers of just people who love biomechanics, and he breaks things down as well as anyone to make it nice and simple so you can apply it to your own training without the guff. And this has taken Ben a while to get to be able to apply it and talk about it in such a kind of easy to digest way. And we talk a bit about his background. He's actually been coaching people hands-on longer than he has actually been in the online sphere, but has now moved into biomechanics and education formally for the most part now. So we dive into what first got him interested in biomechanics, where he learn about it initially, and then we talk a bit about him as an individual. Does he ever feel kind of any sort of inability to gain people's confidence because of his own physique, in that he isn't some crazy jacked IFBB pro bodybuilder? How does he deal with that? And then we talk about some kind of basic biomechanics that every bodybuilder should know and why they should be applying that to their own training, and some of the misunderstandings that may be out there in the larger field that are you probably find frustrating, I find frustrating, and Ben finds frustrating. Really great chat with Ben. I think you guys will really enjoy this, so enjoy. This podcast is brought to you by MacroFactor, the smartest nutrition app on the market. Think of it like MyFitnessPal, but supercharged. It outperforms it in every single way. You just enter your details and goals, log your food, and wait. From there, MacroFactor fine-tunes your plan automatically, giving your body exactly what it needs to stay on track and reach your goals, without the guesswork. If you ever get paralysis by analysis and end up guessing what nutrition you need, you'll dig MacroFactor, as it will give you the science-backed targets individualized to you and your goals. Plus, it will adjust your calories just like a coach on a week-to-week basis to keep up with the changes in your metabolism. So ditch the outdated apps and get with the times. Download MacroFactor today and use my code STRONGER to get 2 weeks completely free via the App Store or Google Play, or find it linked in the description below. Now with that said, let's get into today's show. Ben, we're diving straight in with a question that is, do you think biomechanics has been overhyped in bodybuilding, particularly in content, bodybuilding content, almost at the expense of just lifting hard and progressing?
The biomechanics guy, what am I supposed to say, you know? No, none of it matters. It's all been overhyped. No. I think that biomechanics has been through multiple phases since I've entered the space, which has been about 6 years or so, roughly. When I entered the industry, or whatever we can call this space that we're in, who really knows what to call it, it was kind of like not really discussed, not really talked about it, at least, 2019, 2020, to my understanding, in my bubble. I recognize people have different bubbles, but in my bubble, it wasn't super talked about. But then right around the time, let's say like a little bit post-COVID, kind of during COVID, which is really when I started posting content, it slowly started to ramp up and up and up. And like most things, there was this sort of gradual period of rising in popularity. And then once a couple people start to really pay attention to it, it could even be 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 people with big followings. All of a sudden, the trickle-down effect, as with all other things on social media, is just like it creates this humongous rise in popularity of the subject. You see this with the length and partial discussion. You see this with the stability discussion. You see this with the volume discussion, with the intensity discussion, right? It's every sort of variable or surrounding exercise, I think, goes through this period of like peaking and troughing and peaking and troughing. And so I think the sort of peak of biomechanics, like the degree of importance which people place on biomechanics, probably was highest like maybe a couple years ago when people were really starting to get into it. And now I think it's kind of taking more of a back seat again, because something else kind of like emerged off of that initial biomechanics explosion, which is this, I think, new sort of science-based TikTok, YouTube phenomenon of the evidence-based influencer, the science-based content creator, which I actually view as very distinct from biomechanics, which many people conflate with biomechanics. So a lot of people, I think, will label me as a science-based creator, and I resent the term so much now that I've also never really labeled myself as that. But anyway, there's been this sort of lumping effect. So I think there was this rise, initially, and now I think that the biomechanics stuff, it's losing a bit of traction because people are just losing respect for the sort of empirical, quest for knowledge as just all sort of the same like hunk of bullshit, right? Which has been really unfortunate to see. And I think now we're at a place with biomechanics, at least just speaking for myself, where what I have tried to do and what I think a lot of people are now trying to do is they're trying to talk about it in sort of the way maybe that it initially should have been talked about, which was like instead of putting so much emphasis on it as if it were this new amazing thing that will increase your gains by 2, 3, 4 times, now people are just kind of talking about it as it relates to like, hey, what do I want to target? At what muscle length am I targeting with this variation? And those sorts of things I think are very concrete, they're very practical, and they're very easy to understand. So I think that with all other things, pendulum swinging is kind of the theme. And once the pendulum kind of gets back to a point where it's not quite stopped, but it's kind of just floating in the middle somewhere, I think that's kind of where we currently are at with biomechanics, personally speaking. But I think a lot of people still view it as really too far in one direction because they're conflating biomechanics with the evidence-based, science-based content, if that sort of connection makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, the science-based lifter, and I can see why you don't want to be classed kind of as that. And it's a bit of a weird term when you think of what science is. And I've always looked at science as like a positive thing. So if you asked me 5 years ago, if someone was to class you as a science-based lifter, how would you feel about it? I'd be like, yeah, that's cool. Like that's kind of why I espouse a sort of evidence-based kind of podcast that we're on here and all of this. Whereas now it's like, oh, no way. I don't want to be like tarnished with that brush because of what's kind of become of that person, which is a shame. And like you said, you definitely see these trends within the industry. I think you've been in it for a similar time to me, like a decade or so. And yeah, these swings and roundabouts come through. And I think the problem is when people forget, like this biomechanics, like shiny new toy comes in and they forget, volume, intensity, like these other programming variables that matter a lot. Definitely saw it with technique. I certainly had this with my own training where I wouldn't conflate technique and biomechanics, although they're very, very similar. There was like this overemphasis on like clean, pristine technique for a period of time, which I've spoken about on the podcast with, I think I did an episode with Jeffrey Verity Schofield on the podcast, where it's like, and then further from that, we had data coming out from like the scientific industry that looked into, okay, how important is technique? It's like, actually, like it's not such a thing. And again, you can't pull that apart from intensity, biomechanics, volume, all the programming variables that matter. For some reason, I think it really becomes clear with nutrition, where it's like you can't just have all the protein and think your diet's perfect. It's like you have to look at the whole diet as a whole. But with programming, people get really carried away with various aspects there. You actually had a video recently on your YouTube, which I liked, and it was a pet peeve, basically, that you had. And it's very similar to my own pet peeve that I've had with technique, though. Not necessarily kind of biomechanics, but it was this sense of overcomplicating things. And I think actually, I think you said it even in the video. Some people might think of you as overcomplicating things, but you also mentioned it, and I would agree, having consumed quite a lot of your content, you're trying to like go into the complex and make it uncomplicated. You're not trying to add to the overcomplicated aspect of it. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more on that kind of that pet peeve of yours.
Yeah, a lot of threads to pull here. The first thing I would say is I think everyone in any domain of knowledge goes through a kind of similar patterns, similar phases of learning, right? There's the introductory phase, which are you familiar, Steve, with the midwit meme?
I know exactly the midwit meme.
Okay,
It's
hopefully
a classic,
the listeners,
so good.
yeah, hopefully the listeners know, or they can Google it or whatever. But it's basically these 3 phases that represent like beginner, intermediate, advanced. And, the beginner and the advanced person are kind of saying very similar things. In this one biomechanics related example, it might be like, biomechanics don't matter on some level, right? Because there are all these other variables to consider, which is kind of a silly thing to say, but we'll just stick with the example. Somewhere in the middle, the person who maybe learns a little bit about biomechanics, but not enough to really know a ton, they start to form like increasingly stronger and stronger opinions about things that they tend not to understand very well. So the people who are kind of in the Dunning-Kruger sort of intermediate stage of learning are in a stage where they think they know way more than they do. And as a consequence, they say all sorts of crazy, super overly confident things. And I feel like for me personally, that has been my exact phase where it's like I got introduced to biomechanics X number of years ago. I was obsessed with it. I was so passionate about it. I just wanted to share everything that I knew and was learning at the time. And so there was this kind of like hyper obsession and this zooming in. I think that if you're taking any topic seriously, that is an absolutely necessary phase. Like people look at it as like a bad thing, as a thing that is destructive. And in some ways, yeah, it is. Like everything has trade-offs. But like if you're really going to give yourself to a topic or education in any sense, you have to overdo it, right? Much like in training, you got to get to a point where you're like, okay, that right there, that was the line, right? And then you pull back from the line. So for me, that was the introduction. And then over time, I slowly came to kind of understand more and more about the topic, more and more about the myriad variables that need to be considered all at the same time. And I'm kind of at a point now where I'm trying to take into account all of the information that I think is important, but I'm trying through content just to give the sort of most essential concrete elements of the bigger picture so that people can, take something valuable away and apply it immediately and in a way that is actually impactful, not in some sort of mental masturbation type of sort of abstraction way. And I think that, the video that you're referring to, I was criticizing this influencer who basically took like 5 minutes to say nothing about an exercise when he could have just shown the exercise, done a few reps and been like, hey, like try this thing for yourself. This targets this thing, right? Um, I was in the sort of overcomplicating stage of things when my knowledge was a lot less than it is now. And the more that I've learned, and I know that I have much more to learn, the more that I just recognize that what I actually care about is understanding the information myself and getting other people to understand it. And when that is at the sort of pinnacle of importance for you as a creator or even just as a coach, you actually prioritize that over your own sort of egocentric idea of like, I need to come off in this very intelligent way, and therefore I need to overcomplicate this very basic ass pull down motion. And so I feel like that sort of phase is very natural, but a lot of people get stuck in the kind of beginning phase and they just kind of get comfortable there, maybe because they're seeing material success, financially or followers or likes, whatever it happens to be. They get to a point where they're satisfied based on sort of what that sort of fake understanding has gotten them. And so they don't feel a need to kind of push the understanding more. So they never really get to the other side of like wanting to make, communication simple. The sort of one of the most famous examples of this is the famous scientist and Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman, who basically was like, one of the smartest dudes to ever live in modern physics, to my understanding, but who like you can go on YouTube and you can learn about quantum mechanics in like the simplest possible way, in a way that might be slightly reductionistic, but also in a way that is really concrete and sort of easily understood. So the more that I've done this, the more people I've interacted with who are really, really competent and knowledgeable at what they do, the more that I've moved in the direction of trying to just put my ego aside. And I think I've received a lot of positive feedback in that transition. But I do think that you, as a creator, as a coach or whatever, I think you do need to go through those sort of phases and those pendulum swings for yourself to eventually come out the other end with that perspective. Because if all you do is you just hear people talk about this and you never experience it for yourself, just like anything else, it kind of seems abstract and just like people are regurgitating other people about the same sorts of things. So I've just cared progressively more about how I can help people. And that has really, I think, steered me in the right direction and has allowed me to mature and has allowed me to make better content. It's not to say that I don't screw up or get things wrong. I do all the time. But I think you just kind of come to understand that all those other things are sort of secondary to actually helping the people that are in your audience. So I don't know exactly how that was connected to anything that you said, but that was the first thing that sort of came up for me. And I really just hope that like over time, more and more creators, really the creators that sort of rise to the top are the ones that really, really have this pinnacle importance on helping, the viewer, helping the audience member, rather than just sort of building themselves up on top of this sort of house of cards of knowledge.
So well said. That description of that midwhip meme, and that obviously it relates really well to the Dunning-Kruger effect as well, is something I've certainly been through myself. And it's something you see in a lot of younger lifters and content creators where they almost seem like they know everything and they're like that nerdy guy that comments and critiques like bodybuilders who are twice their size. And once you've been doing this, like as long as we have, hopefully you've gone through it and you've come out the other side and you're like, like dumb me almost knows exactly what I should have been doing in the first place. Like you said, that person at Stark who really simplifies things. But I think it's because you know it so well. Now you can simplify it and you can explain it to like a child if you really know your stuff. Something you said in that video was, after you consume X piece of content, do you feel more confused or less confused afterwards? And it's not a good sign if you feel more confused after looking into it. And that's what I try and do with some of the stuff I go through now, where I'm like, I probably look back at some infographics I released 5-10 years ago. And I'm like, man, Steve, what were you even saying there? I don't even agree with half of it. Or I can just add so many layers of nuance and context on top. That's far more helpful. I've definitely gone too deep into some topics and spoken maybe too confidently, like on deloads, for example. I'm sure there was a time where I was like, no, you absolutely must deload this sort of frequency. You can't be training hard if you haven't deloaded in, like, I don't know, a couple of months. I'm like, now I look at it, I'm like, Steve, like there's people who had years upon you, lots of wisdom to add, who you should have listened to a bit more. I don't know if you find yourself doing that, Ben, where you look at people who have been doing this just a long time. They've been in the game for, I don't know, double the length you have, and you really value their opinion just due to that time element.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because there are some people who have been in the industry for a very long period of time who I'm like, wow, that dude is still speaking like they're in that sort of intermediate stage, you know? But there are many, you know, exceptions to that rule, obviously. And there are also so many people who are not at all on social media who have just a tremendous wealth of knowledge to share, that I, you know personally. One of them who I mentioned to you before we were chatting is my training partner, who's been, you know, training like, I don't know, 20 plus years at this point, just has just a wealth of knowledge and understanding, and no one has access to him because, you know, he just lives his life off social media. And so there's so many people like that I sort of have been made aware of in the last, you know, 3-4 years, and obviously him before that. But, you know, you just start to see like a common thread, a common pattern amongst those hyper competent people, which is that they're always at all times in the process of learning. They're always seeking. They're never stuck where they are. And the reason that they're never stuck where they are, I was thinking about this actually while I was pooping this morning, which is which is, just thought I'd throw that in there, which is this idea that, like, if you are someone who's really competent at anything, really, you are constantly failing. Like, you're just basically falling on your face repeatedly. And the people who are on the outside of that looking in will, who tend not to understand, will judge that from afar and look at that like, oh, look at this person. What he said was different, you know, just like you mentioned, what he said now is different from what he said, you know, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even 6 months ago. And most people look at that and think that that is something to be ashamed of, or that is something, because they themselves, when they're wrong, they feel embarrassed, they feel ashamed. And I think that's perfectly natural. But what I sort of think now is that the people who are typically the best at their jobs are the people who just failed faster and for longer than everyone else, and who not only did that, but who could, like, basically learn very, very quickly from each failure, right? Such that they arrive at a point where they have all this perspective behind them and they have the ability to say, hey, I thought this 5 years ago and now I think this, and I'm actually proud of that. Because for me personally, I know, I'm sure this might be true for you too, Steve, is if I have an opinion that's like 5 years old, I kind of get a little uncomfortable with it. I'm like, what? I feel like that's been the same for too long. Like, maybe I should look into that now. And I just feel like, especially, I mean, training is a great analogy, right? Like, the exercises that maybe felt really great for you 2 years ago, 1 year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, maybe they feel not so good for you now. It's just like the natural course of all things is this constant change. And so I think that if you're ever going to really learn about a topic deeply, you just have to accept that that is not just like a side effect. That's like the main thing. The main thing is just falling on your face repeatedly, learning from falling on your face, and then hopefully doing it less over time, and then being able to translate it to other people as you do that.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, no failures, just lessons, and that's the way to approach life. And you're completely right. I think it's actually a problem if you look at a content creator or I don't know, an educator in the space, and they haven't updated their beliefs for so many years. That starts to become a problem, and that's where you see people who have maybe, I don't know, set up their business based off something they learned very early on. I always use the example of like flexible dieting was like huge back in like 2010, somewhere around there, and then people set up their whole like business based off around this. It's like, not that that's the kind of principles of flexible dieting hold, I think, but there could be things where, I don't know, I could see as an example, Milo Wolf. I'm sure there was a time he was going to, just like Brett Contreras is the glute guy, Milo Wolf was going to maybe call himself like, I don't know, length and partials guy or something, like long muscle length guy. So I'm sure he said he was thinking about that, or he was going to release a program, I think, all based around like length and partials and long muscle length training. And then he decided, hey, actually, I'm not going to go down that route. So it's just, interesting to see kind of who updates, who doesn't. And I think it's important to fail, just like you said, and shouldn't be afraid of that or embarrassed at all. And even better if you can say, hey, like I made that mistake, right? You can call out the things that you've said wrong, which I think is great. Obviously, previously I said you've been in the industry a decade, and I actually think the majority of that time has been offline, not online. Is that right? Where you're coaching athletes at, I'm going to say the college name wrong, so I'm going to let you say the college name. So I'd love to hear, how did you get into the industry in the first place, and how's like your role within the industry evolved over time?
Yeah, well, I guess I had the classic like introduction to lifting via sport, and that was that was maybe 12 years ago now. But I never really was able to really even take lifting seriously until the end of my high school years, which was, I would have been 17 at the time. I'm 26 now. So I'm still, I think, relatively early on in the span of my career, if you'll call it that. But I originally started taking lifting really seriously about that amount of time ago. And I was lucky enough to go to Gettysburg College, is how you say it, Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. Shout out to them, where I was able to pretty quickly start sort of informally training friends, which is just like, what does that really mean? I mean, part of that was just helping people out in the gym, just based off of the little that I understood at the time. Part of it was starting to actually program for people who were at my college with me, so I could send them an online program, but then I could also see them in person. And that was all just, it was never financially motivated or anything. I was doing it for free for enjoyment. And I was also able to start interning at the strength and conditioning program at my college pretty early on too. So I got to work with all different kinds of people, all different kinds of teams. I worked with the football team, the lacrosse team, the baseball team, the softball team, the tennis team, the volleyball team. So many different kinds of athletes, many of whom didn't want to be in the gym, which honestly made the quest for gains even more interesting, working with people who, didn't really want to be there. But I was able to get a lot of reps under my belt in person very early on, which I consider myself lucky to have done. And then by the time I graduated college, I basically had a full book of online clients, and I was able to easily actually transition into in-person training in New York City for several years before I then started to transition more to the education space. So I was basically, training people for, I don't know, from start to now would have been 3, 4, 5, 6 years, like in person, and people of all different types. Honestly, Steve, I eventually got a little bit, I want to say, bored with the particular kind of training that I ended up doing. It was just basically like, and I loved all my, not all my clients. I loved most of my clients. I could see some of them 2 times a week, 3 times a week. At some point though, in your personal training journey, you get to a point where you've had the same clients for some amount of time, and they kind of know what to do. They know how to do it. They know, roughly what weight they're going to use. And so the whole session now is no longer about like problem solving this pain or, getting them to feel this target muscle that they'd never felt before. It's more just about kind of like being their friend and being there to sort of function as a source of motivation, just based on the constraint of them paying you having a scheduled time for them to come. And that just for me was never what I was really passionate about. I didn't want to just end up in a place where I was doing that forever. And there's nothing absolutely wrong with doing that. But it just, for me, at a certain point, it became less and less stimulating because I was always trying to, or really I had a desire to just solve problems, and to try to help people, who were maybe more invested in training, right? Which is mostly just through the online space now. But, every once in a while I get to travel, I get to train with someone in the industry, I'll get to help them solve their problems. Most of the people who I work with now, will do consultation type stuff with me, whether that's online or in person. More recently, I've been able to do some seminars in person for a couple gyms and their staff, which has been really, really fun, just to kind of actually start to work with trainers in person. So that's kind of been the trajectory, which is like basically just I got lucky with opportunities. I was able to work with people in person, and then I eventually kind of transitioned out of it when I became much more enamored with the education side of things and wanting to teach and help other people. And I have a lot of people to thank for the help along the way, and still now I feel like I'm still just kind of early on in my career, like I said. But I think overall the transition for me has been more toward the teaching side of things, but I do find that in-person work is still the most gratifying. It's just that now I'm at a point where I'm much more interested in working with, people like bodybuilders who just want to like do a session with me and solve this shoulder pain that they have, or be able to actually feel their lats for the first time, or maybe everything is good and they just want to get like, beaten into the ground with like a really tough session. Like those are the kinds of things that now really excite me. But I think all of those things along the way have been really, really necessary, almost by definition.
Makes a ton of sense. And I think it shows in your ability to communicate that. I mean, the fact you're only 26, I didn't know how old you were prior to this discussion. And I think based off hearing you talk and having seen like long form content from yourself, I think you're mature beyond your years and well able to communicate, which I think is also why you've grown to the size that you are and able to do the sort of work that you're doing. I think back at me at 26, I was like a few years into the industry and definitely not well equipped at doing that. I barely feel like it now. But having said that, I completely relate to you in terms of the type of clientele you can work with. And it is very gratifying working with anyone and improving their kind of health and well-being and life in general. But there are bodybuilders that are like, not bodybuilders, sorry, personal trainers who are just, I had them when I worked one-on-one as a PT, and I could just see a few of the personal trainers who did really well. And they were just like that person that just was so lovable, and they were so like eccentric, and they were just like complete people person. Whereas like me, introverted, like definitely not that extrovert type of thing. I found personal training quite exhausting. I enjoyed it, but the online side, just you can work with whoever you want really across the globe, reach way more people, and potentially work with more interesting cases. So I totally relate to you on that front. I'd be really interested to know how you got into like specifically biomechanics. I think you said 2020 was when you were like more so putting your foot into that door of things, because that's what you're known for now, right? So where were you first learning, kind of what got you interested in the first place going down that route?
Yeah, well, the first thing was just kind of weird. The first time I ever bought something that was like anatomy based was actually in high school. I would have been, I think, 16. I don't even remember what the book was, but I was super fascinated by muscles, and so I went on Amazon, and I had gathered enough money for my summer job to be able to buy this little textbook. And that was like my first exposure. I don't know why I was interested in it. I just thought it was cool. Maybe it's because I was always into lifting, and it just felt like it just felt like more sensible to me to know like anatomy if I was going to be lifting. But I would say I really started deep diving at some point in college. I want to say 2019 was about the year. It was when I took a couple of courses at my college, one of which was orthopedic anatomy, and another of which was neuromuscular physiology. And the orthopedic anatomy class, shout out to Dr. Little. Dr. Little is the man. He's an orthopedic surgeon, I believe, specializes in the shoulder, if I'm not mistaken. And he just had this like vigor and this passion that he was one of those teachers, I'm sure you've had at least one, who like just the energy just like radiated off of him, his excitement about the topic. And it's not that wasn't already in me, because I think that it was, but I think he really pushed me more and more and more in that direction. And you know something similar was happening at that time, which was I was really into powerlifting. So like that's kind of how I transitioned from sport to lifting, was into powerlifting, because I felt like when I stopped playing sports, I played sports my whole life. I played baseball, lacrosse, football, and when I left sport, there was this kind of competitive vacuum that I felt like I needed to be sort of filled. And so I think that's why I found powerlifting before I found the more bodybuilding style stuff. And as you probably know, Steve, powerlifters, I wasn't like a formal competitor or anything. It's just like recreational, did for my own, but I took it very seriously. Powerlifters are hurt all the time. It's just like you're just pushing yourself constantly. I was however, late teens at the time. That's the time to hurt yourself. If you're going to hurt yourself, pretty much. And so I was constantly hurt. And I felt like a sensible thing to do might be to learn even more about the anatomy and the biomechanics, because if I can just understand that, then I can not be hurt anymore. Now, you fast forward many years later, pain is a complex subject. Pain science to me is super fascinating, and I've learned a lot about it relative to what I used to know in the last couple of years. But at the time, the sort of what is termed the kinesiopathic model of pain, I believe it's referred to as. Basically, it kind of treats, the body like it's a car or something. You go into the shop, the mechanic takes a look, and, a few screws, a few bolts, replace this part, and you're good to go. And that was kind of the old school model of pain, but there's still validity to it today in a lot of ways. And for me personally, it seemed to have worked in some way or another. And I had tremendous issues with my right shoulder that, through just me learning more about the biomechanics stuff, I was able to alleviate pain in that area, frequent injury in that area. Same thing with my left hip, my left low back. Those are issues that I used to have, but now no longer do, for a sort of wide variety of reasons, but the main of which I think was just really my interest in the biomechanics stuff and learning more about it. So my inroad was kind of a combination of interest that I already sort of had, teachers that loved the topic that sort of pulled it out of me, and then just actual experience of being in pain all the time and wanting to get out of pain. And like I said, there are a lot of factors that influence pain, but there's obviously a biomechanical influence of pain that is super relevant for people who are interested in PT or just personal training. So I think that those were kind of the three main rocks, and that transition more toward, the hypertrophy related, muscle specific targeting related stuff, kind of at the time where I started to get a little bit bored of the pain stuff. So that's kind of the order of operations. And now it's kind of just like all of them are occurring simultaneously at the same time. And I don't really consider myself as in one sort of bucket or another when it comes to that side of biomechanics.
Sure. Yeah, really cool actually hearing about that. I think a lot of our kind of very keen interests are driven from like a selfish perspective initially. And then you just learn, you're like, oh man, this could benefit so many people if they could apply these things to themselves. That's only, it was my actual experience. Like after I had an accident and then found like nutrition and training principles and bodybuilding, I'm like, oh, I could build a better body and get into the best shape of my life. I was like, man, other people need to know about this stuff. I was so confused before I started seeing through the matrix almost with macros and just basic progressive overload and principles that were like back then when I was getting into things, they weren't widely spoken about. So yeah, very cool to hear about that kind of inroad, and that actually you were into powerlifting, but you now, do you strictly bodybuild now? And do you have any competitive endeavors on a side note?
So the short answer is no. I don't have an
get
interest.
you on stage.
Yeah, no, hell no, dude. I mean, I hear about it through, people like yourself and, through people like my friend. And I don't know, there's been enough of like the sort of living vicariously through other people that I've worked with, trained with, helped, that, satisfies that need for me. But in relation to the first thing you said, the sort of self-interested stuff, I think that's almost like, it's almost like the bedrock of any interest is how does this apply to me? And then thinking that I mean, it's kind of the same conversation we had before. It's like, this thing applied to me, and so therefore it must apply to all other people. And then you start to work with other people and you're like, oh, maybe it doesn't work out so well for them. And then you kind of settle on a middle ground. But Yeah, no current competitive interests, but I was really, really deep down the powerlifting rabbit hole. I worked up to what I think are like some respectable-ish numbers, but I currently don't pursue much of that. I was actually thinking, Steve, weirdly enough, that today's my leg day. I do one leg day a week. That I might just do some conventional deadlifts for the sake of it, just to be like, hey, where is this at? Just based on the bodybuilding style stuff, it's probably not terrible. It's probably not where it was, but it might be interesting to do some experimentation today.
It's always fun to let the ego just go and like just lift some heavy shit, let your Ronnie Coleman out now and then. And if you haven't done a lift for a long time, but you're advanced, like you've been lifting a long time, so your technique isn't terrible, it's sometimes kind of surprising how strong you are at lift. So yeah, that's cool. And fair enough on competing. It's very extreme, especially for the competitive side. And yeah, definitely not for everyone. On a side note, actually, have you ever felt that your physique has impacted your ability to communicate or to get buy-in from people? How have you kind of felt that?
So yes. And I would say that this was at its peak importance for me, like feeling insecure about my size, my level of body fat, especially in bodybuilding and in really any like lifting related job. Like the aesthetics are a built-in part of every bit of information you consume, whether you really know it or not. Like there are people who can rationally understand that, okay, what a person says and what a person looks like are not necessarily related, but they often can be. And, there was and is credence to, or uh, I'll say there was and is validity to the criticism of like, if you're going to talk about muscle growth and you're going to talk about exercise, like it stands to reason that you should be at least somewhat strong, somewhat developed, like you should look somewhat muscular. I don't think I buy into this idea that like the physique doesn't matter at all. And I also don't buy into the idea that like you should listen to someone because of their physique. I think both of those things fall for the same trap. So for me, my sort of quest over the last 3 years specifically was just to get as big and as muscular as possible, not as possible, but, you know, as possible for me, given that I don't want to become, a bodybuilder, given that I don't want to put steroids in my body or anything like that. I just want to be the biggest Ben that I can be while not looking fat, basically. And so I've done that over the last several years, and I have gained a lot of credibility with some people having put on a lot more size. If you look at pictures of me now relative to pictures of me 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I sit at about, I want to say 15 pounds heavier, at a relatively similar, maybe slightly higher, but similar body fat. So that has been like a lot of progress in a relatively short period of time, because that was kind of like my bodybuilding sort of noob stage. Again, if I was just powerlifting, I was like never doing anything to failure. I was never doing any isolation stuff. I was never concerned with stability. I just wanted my squat, bench, and deadlift to go up. So even though I had been lifting for a while, I had never really deeply considered the bodybuilding side of things, the sort of nutrition side of things. So to get to your question and your point, I think it's important. And I think that people who are really hyper intellectual, I think do themselves a little bit of a disservice, not paying more attention to the way that they look. I think there's this kind of like moral high ground that people take saying, oh, I don't need to play that, physique game. I just think that people are people, and people are going to judge you by your appearance first and foremost. And I think that just is a part of the game. And I think that you should lean into that as long as you can sort of keep yourself mentally sane throughout that process. And as long as you can not be super consumed by that. So for me, in my earlier stages, I was really, really, really concerned with how I appeared. I always wanted to make myself, this angle, that angle. And now I'm kind of at a point where I've proven to much of my sort of foundational audience that like Ben has gotten bigger and stronger over this period of time. And the people who are really not satisfied with the way that I look now, tend to be, on average, the kind of person who is never going to buy an ebook, a course, a product. So I really don't give a fuck anyway. There's a certain threshold at which, like, unless you look like Ronnie Coleman, you don't know what you're talking about. That is not my audience. That's not for me. So that's kind of where I've ended up, is at somewhat of a middle ground. And, yeah, I've been training arms twice a week for the last, since the beginning of this year to account for that, because I think that's probably my weakest area.
Nice. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being honest, because I know a lot of people that consume the podcast are like content creators, they are coaches themselves, and they probably relate heavily to what you've said. And I certainly had the same thing, like being a bodybuilder and people looking at me and being like, you barely look like you lift and this sort of thing. And even now, I think no matter where you are in your career, like I'm a pro natural bodybuilder with like arguably the best federation there is available for me to compete with, but I still get people saying I look like a swimmer, and then other people will be like, oh no, you're clearly on roids. So yeah, you're never going to win with people, but I think there is something to those either extremes of like, hey, you can't just be a lab coat like sitting behind a desk and doing these things. Similarly, if you're just jacked, like you can't trust that person knows it best, because there's something to experiencing it. So it's really cool to know like, hey, over the last years, you've gained serious muscle mass, because I have no doubt you've learned actually more through that practice of the endeavor than just like you can through just singly textbooks.
100%.
Which I think is what people miss sometimes. So they're like, they just try and mirror a textbook answer.
Yeah, that experience bit that's so spot on. It's good that you mentioned that, because I definitely feel like that has been one of the biggest, like, not like the thing that I've learned the most from, like, intellectually in a sense, but more so like it has helped guide my intellectual direction, if that makes sense. Like it was the thing that led me into looking into specific things over other things. And that obviously had an influence on my content, like just figuring out what actually matters to create progress. And, since the beginning of this year, just to give a specific example, like I've been putting a really high priority on biceps, triceps, forearms, and middle delts, just because I had never done like a serious like specialization, quote unquote, phase for really anything. And since the beginning of this year, I've put about, I think it was like 0.45 inches on the circumference of my arms, unpumped, from like 16 inches to like 16 and a half ish. And I've gained pretty much no weight during that process. So, you'll get people saying like, sometimes this is somewhat of a tangent, but I posted a video about arm training, just like a long form video where, I was doing, I think in total, maybe 10 sets for biceps, 8 sets for triceps or something. And some guy commented, you're doing too much volume. You're doing too much volume, Ben. And I'm thinking to myself like, okay, well, what would define too much volume? Too much volume would be like, you're not making progress to me. That's like the simplest version of that. So if I have this bank of progress in front of me, I done the measurements, I've tracked it over time, and I've put half an inch of my arms in, whatever, 8 months, 9 months, 8.5, 9 months. That's like the only evidence that I really ultimately care about. Have I gotten more jacked? So, to your point, it's such a big piece to the puzzle, because you can simply just talk about the evidence that is in front of you and your own experience. And when you have specific metrics, it does help. But also, like, even if no one paid any attention to the specific numbers and the timeframes, that I've just described, it's like, okay, this dude is bigger than he was last year. So clearly what he's doing is helping, and clearly there is validity in actual experience to back up the intellectual side of things. It's not just sort of, again, mental masturbation or anything similar.
Yeah, so well said. I think to that point, it gives people from the outside looking in more confidence that kind of what you're espousing. But also, I've at least found I've gained a lot more confidence being like, I just brush off these like, if people critique like bits of information, I'm like, oh, but the kind of proof's in the pudding. Like I have this body of evidence that I clearly know what I'm doing with myself and clients now. Now I've been doing it long enough. It's taken me a long time to get here, Ben, to feel like pretty confident in what I'm saying. Yeah. But now kind of that experience piece is just so key. We've spoken about it a few times in terms of your online side, and like a following of 700,000 on Instagram is no small feat. That's massive. I'd love to hear, because that's only 3 years. I was actually looking at how many posts you've made. I was like, oh my god, like I haven't the numbers in front of me, but I've made a lot more posts than you, Ben. Put it that way. I've been on Instagram quite a lot longer, but yeah. So you've completely blown up. How's that impacted you? How's that growth impacted you?
I would say that, strangely enough, it has grown me as a person, much more than I would have expected. And what I mean by that is, when you kind of like live out your life in that sort of public online way, there is this challenge of, who do I want to present publicly versus who am I like privately? And when I started out on Instagram, uh, there was this sense that like I needed to kind of put on some kind of performance. I needed to say certain things to attract attention solely for the sake of attention. I needed to express opinions more strongly than I should have for the sake of getting engagement and those sorts of things. And over time, I was lucky enough to have kind of people in my life to keep me in check, to challenge me on that, to challenge me on who I was presenting in public versus who I actually am face to face. And over the last couple of years, like, dealing with that challenge has been something that has benefited me in my own, sort of personality, my personal life. It's benefited me as much as anything else in my life, in the sense that I have taken it very seriously to be aware of kind of the direction that I'm going online. Like, who am I? Who am I really, versus who do I want other people to think that I am? Like, just asking that question of like, who am I trying to present myself as? Do I feel this insecurity where, you know, I want to try to use bigger words than I should so that other people think that I'm smarter? Do I want to, take a picture of myself on the beach, shirtless, at this perfect angle, and I'm going to take this photo 50 times to make sure it looks perfect so that I can post it? Do I want to take a picture in front of, my new apartment or my new house or my new car? Just, not that those things apply to me, but those kinds of questions, like, when I have directed them back at myself, have really been useful in learning more about myself and like what I actually want, and to just have people in my corner who have really kept me in check in that regard. I'm so grateful for, because I feel like now, in this conversation with you and in my YouTube content and my Instagram content, like, that's just like me now. That's just me. And, it's so low effort in the sense that there's no like performance to it like there used to be. There doesn't feel like there's this kind of uncomfortable, cloying desire to like approval seek. It's kind of just like, this is me and I'm going to put it out there. And if people don't like it, like, cool, but there are a lot of people obviously who seem to be at least somewhat attracted to it. And to sort of be able to separate that from my own sense of like personal validation has almost been therapeutic in a sense. And I feel like in this online space, when people grow on Instagram, on YouTube, on podcasting, whatever, they start to like almost like commoditize themselves in a way that is personally detaching. They start to like view themselves as a product or service that other people, are consuming. And on some level that's true, in the sense that, I'm create content. People don't actually know me personally, so they view me as like this content creator thing. But like, when you start to create that separation and you start to move like farther away from who you actually are, I think that just wreaks havoc on every like important aspect of your life. So much more than like the financial progress that I've made, which I've been happy with, much more than like just the superficial representation of like approval. The most important and sort of revealing thing to me is that you can actually use this kind of experience to your benefit in a way that is growth promoting. And I think a lot of people kind of lose sight of that because they don't really have a corner of people around them who are sort of keeping the guardrails on and making sure that you're moving in the right direction. So kind of a little bit of a weird abstract answer, I think, but I just think that for me personally, it's been really, really useful in growing myself as a person. And I think that if more people can look at it that way and kind of marrying who you are as a person and who you are online, I think that it just creates a better scenario for everyone, because I think that you end up making more original content that way. I think your content ends up being better that way. On YouTube, I intentionally kind of am making things like lower effort, lower quality. I'm kind of just putting things out as it's intuitive to me. And that has been much more rewarding, despite this other video that I did getting 200,000 views. This one over here that got 900 felt much better to make. It was much more exciting to make. And so I think when you can marry the business and the personal in that sort of a way, you get, I think, what is an optimal outcome for yourself and also, whoever is in the audience. And I think that the more that people do that, you obviously are someone who I think is doing a great job of that, at least from my perspective. The more that people actually gain benefit from your content, and the more that people, I think, connect with you as an actual person, the more that the internet can feel like something that was originally, I think, kind of supposed to be, rather than this thing that is now doing the opposite, where everyone is just their own pretend persona and everyone is just kind of pushing everyone away from one another. So I will stop ramble there, but that's
really cool. Yeah, and I appreciate also you feeling that way about me. I can only reflect upon some of my very early YouTube videos where I was putting on a front. I was trying to mimic some other people in the space.
Hey guys,
Matt
what's
Ogus.
up?
Yeah, stuff like that. The Hodge twins. Do you know the Hodge twins, Ben? Or are you too young for that?
Oh,
you know the
hilarious,
Hodge twins. Cool.
Dude, hilarious.
Yeah, so I'm not that, and I tried to do that, and I quickly moved away from it. But somewhat quickly, I think. And you're right, it's completely exhausting to put on a mask or a front. And I think that would lead to burnout completely. I can even think of times in the semi-recent past where I've had supplement sponsorships and they've asked me to review a product. And they're like, can you be a bit more over to me, completely over the top, this tastes amazing. So I'm like, that's just not me. I'm never going to do that for you. So I'm super uncomfortable with that sort of thing. And it's totally exhausting, as you mentioned. And I think that's actually why over the past few years, I found your content more and more more engaging, and I've wanted to consume it more. And it's eventually led me to want to bring you on the podcast. And I've actually recently purchased some of your products that you had available, because I was just I like this guy. He clearly knows what he's talking about. He presents really well and is very authentic. And I don't get these guys who have millions of followers who you can just tell it's all fake. They're just talking complete bogus. But I don't know. Some people obviously love it, and I just am not there. And I think the audience here are very much like myself, and they'll be probably thinking similar to me in terms of they've maybe seen a bit of an evolution of your content and really enjoyed it. This might be a tricky question for you, Ben, though. Do you think needing that persona initially, that almost fake Ben, did you think you needed that to grow an audience and then you could go this way, or do you think you could have just been authentically Ben from the get-go?
Oh man, I'll try to answer the unanswerable, but it would kind of be ridiculous for me to say that it could have been otherwise. It's what would that even really mean to say that it could have been otherwise? Just it is what it was. It's the person, the famous bodybuilder who found this piece of content, who then shared it, and then 5,000 10,000 people found my account because of that. Maybe they only found it because someone who they shared an inflammatory post that I made. So I absolutely think that it was probably necessary, but that's almost just like saying it was what it was. And to be honest, Steve, I think that I wouldn't have really known what authentic Ben even was at the time that I started. Again, this was originally, so my Instagram dates back to a couple, less time that I've actually been posting, because I think I posted for the first time in 2020 or something, or 2021 or something like that. And a bunch of those early posts I just archived. They're just in an archive sitting somewhere. Because from just like an informational standpoint, I wouldn't even want those posts to be out there. That's how concerning they were. Um, but at the time, it was 5.5-ish years ago. I don't know if I would have even had an idea of just like what I wanted, like for myself. So I feel like almost by definition, like whatever I would have been putting out would have been some kind of version of myself that I wasn't exactly aware of or familiar with. So I think it's a really good implication of your point, which is that I think that it is tough to be online for at least in sort of my stage of life, like early 20s into mid 20s now. That's like a period of a lot of change. And to live out that period of change online is very, very difficult in some ways, in the sense that it's very easy for people to just criticize the hell out of you because you're changing a lot, you're evolving a lot. You say stupid shit because you're basically a kid. And you grow up in front of people, and some people will admire that, and some people will just basically think that you're a moron, or think that you know way more than you do. Like you have this sort of self-inflation. Um, and I've just kind of become okay with that, because, the people who are in like my core audience now, I think have respected the sort of journey that I've been on, and they've recognized it as something maybe in themselves that is just like very fundamentally human. And, the people who are sort of standing on the outside of that and criticizing that a lot, I think a lot of people um, sort of are rejecting their own human intuition when they look at someone else's experience of what may be growth, and they think that it's just like something that they've never themselves experienced. When in reality, I think everyone goes through that. It's just that very few people go through that online in front of, hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I think that's really an honest reply, because it's like hindsight's 2020, and also like you can't know what you don't know because you did. It's like playing a video game. I know you like your video games, and you don't know if you chose path A or path B. What path B might have brought, like it could have been a completely different set of circumstances. It's similar to the question of like, could Ronnie Coleman have been Ronnie Coleman at his best without all the injuries? Like we just we don't know. It's all like best guesses at this point. So I think that's really fair. To dive into some of your knowledge, because we've spoken a lot about Ben, and I wanted to do that because this is your first time on, and hopefully I'll be able to have some fun discussions with you in the future. But in terms of biomechanical principles, is there any one that stands out to you as one that you feel like bodybuilders, if they just knew this kind of one principle, this would really kind of set them ahead?
Yeah, I think the biggest framework of understanding that has made the biggest difference for me personally, this is something I originally heard from Tom Purvis, who I'm not sure if you've heard that name before, but he's been around since I think maybe the 80s or something. He's been teaching since then. He's in his 60s now, and he has his place in Oklahoma that he's not on social media. He's kind of in his own man cave teaching there, so he's not like someone who's really online if people are going to search for him. But one perspective that he really drilled into my head pretty early on was this idea that everything that you experience in the gym from like a muscle recruitment standpoint should kind of be looked at as a response rather than something that you are creating. So for example, many people I think get into the gym because they feel like some kind of ability to like contract their muscle, right? Like, oh, I can like make a muscle with my arm. And so resistance training is basically just like me making a muscle with my arm with added load. And I think there's validity to that perspective a little bit, just the idea that like, hey, I can control my body. But my perspective now is really resistance focused first. So rather than thinking about the muscle as the thing that you are controlling, what you're really controlling is how you choose to set up the resistance, i.e. the force of an exercise, so that you can get your body to respond to that force. So an example that's consistent with the last would just be, instead of thinking about a biceps curl as, you contracting your biceps and you adding a dumbbell to your hand, I like to think about it more, and I think it's much more helpful to think about it as, I place a dumbbell in my hand, and what the dumbbell is trying to do is it's trying to straighten my arm. And as my brain will naturally create, my biceps responds to the demands of the load. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to conjure up some image of what my biceps is doing. I don't have to mind muscle connect my way to success. I just have to put a dumbbell in my hand, and I have to start doing curls, right? So in the same sense, every exercise that you do is basically just a muscular response to the forces that you've set up. And that's actually very freeing to recognize, because a lot of the time when people have this, like, I am in control of everything model, what happens is when something doesn't go well in an exercise, like I feel the wrong thing, I have pain, this feels clunky, people assume that they are the problem, right? Because if they're the controllers of everything, if they're the arbiters of success, well, then that must mean that there's something wrong with me, right? But when you take this force first, this resistance first perspective, all that really needs to happen when you're not feeling the right muscle, when you're not feeling the right amount of comfort, is you can just change the resistance, because ultimately your body is just this thing that is responding to the external environment. And if you view that as what is happening primarily, then in the context of, let's say, the pull down that is uncomfortable, instead of saying, I guess my shoulder's just fucked, I need to go to physical therapy, you can be like, what if I change the angle of resistance so that instead of being overhead, it's a little bit more in front of me? Or what if instead of elevating my shoulder as much, maybe I'm a little bit more cautious about that, or something like that, right? So everything is basically just working from the force to the bones to the muscles, rather than from the muscles to the bones to the force. If that kind of order of operations makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. To really simplify it in my head, I'm thinking we're kind of resisting the resistance that's put upon us in many ways. And I really like that kind of description of being like, you're not the problem. It's just that whatever you're doing, you need to maybe execute it slightly differently, because whilst we're all fundamentally very similar in terms of anatomy and how we're put together, like there's little differences, even if it's just a short term, like, hey, someone's just a bit pissed off, like, so you need to navigate around it. That's really cool. Are there any biomechanic principles, if that's the right way to put it, that you think are overemphasized, that you see people talking about? Maybe it's those science-based lifters you see out there that people maybe take too far. I don't know. As an example, I can think of in like nutrition, people talk about calories in, calories out, and it's just like, it's black and white. It's that simple. It's like, oh man, yeah, really dig into some nuance there. Do you have any like that within the biomechanics sphere?
Yeah, I think that this falls under the category of biomechanics slightly. Well, I'll give you two different threads here. So one of them is more biomechanics specific, and another one is more kind of tangential to that. So the biomechanics specific principle that I think people overemphasize is they confuse what might be true normally with what is optimal in every scenario. So let me just give an example. In a bench press, let's say, your shoulder blades, they need to go back. So in the context of a bench press, a lot of times what people cue, powerlifters, as you know, cue shoulder blades back. They often say shoulder blades back and down. The down aspect is really a cue for spinal extension that people use, but we can get into that maybe separately. But in any case, a lot of times what happens is someone who is talking about biomechanics experiences something positive from, let's say, that cue of shoulders back. And so what they do is they extrapolate that one cue, that one fact, to every other scenario that people find themselves moving their shoulder blades in. So what you see commonly is people saying shoulder blades should be back during rows, shoulder blades should be back during lateral raises, shoulder blades should be back during curls, during triceps, during back squats, during deadlifts. Right? So it's just the theme is like single thing that is appropriate and necessary in one scenario that just gets extrapolated out to every other possible scenario, right? Another example might be like, the chest up cue. It's a very similar and sort of paired action. Another one might be the knees out cue, right? Where in one case, it may get rid of someone's pain in one scenario, but in another, it may actually make it worse, right? So it's just this general theme of like single thing that may be appropriate and true in a single scenario applied to many contexts. The other thing, or the other thread that I was reminded of when you brought that up is the concept's now related to kind of stability and like motor unit recruitment, because stability is basically just like resistance of motion is how I prefer to think about it. And recently, as I'm sure you know, in the hypertrophy space, there's been this rise in what I would call the sort of stability panacea, where people just seem to think that like, if I make this motion 5% more stable, that's better. If I make it then 10% more stable, it's better, 20, 30, 40. And it's just as much as is humanly possible, I will just basically tie myself up in this sort of kinky scenario so that I can just be the most stable as humanly possible. And ironically, a lot of the times, the way that these kids are now, like, because they're mostly kids that are doing this, I should say, the way that they're doing motions is like this is painful irony of someone trying to make something as stable as humanly possible and then just creating like 5 more problems as a consequence of that. So the first one for me that comes to mind is like people are now doing, triceps and biceps with like cuffs, and a lot of times they're cuffing very close to their elbow. And, that may have a very useful application, let's say for a client who has forearm or finger or wrist troubles, right? But that may actually just be doing nothing additionally good for someone who's doing a triceps or a biceps exercise. So you get all these people who are trying to solve problems that they don't have based on these hypothetical things that people are now espousing as like the ultimate truth. And what ends up happening is, let's say in the case of a curl or a triceps extension, is when you move a cuff higher up on your elbow, you need to increase the load, right? Because if you move it half the distance closer to the elbow, you might actually have to double the load potentially, or, increase it by 30 or 40%. And when you do that, you're actually increasing the load on the shoulder by the same amount of load that you added to the cuff. So you now see people doing all these weird shrugging things. And instead of doing curls, they're just tipping their entire body backward right over top of a preacher curl. So it's just this kind of like, again, it's similar to the first thing in that they take something that might be useful in one scenario and just extrapolate it to every possible thing. And anything that is taken to such an extreme will eventually create other problems that you then have to solve for. When in reality, a lot of times, none of these things are problems to begin with. People are just kind of searching for what might give them the extra percentage point, which, in some cases may actually be super relevant, but definitely not in these kids who are now unfortunately becoming famous on TikTok. But I do have hope for the industry in this regard, Steve, because I do start to see, or I have started to see a lot of pushback and a lot of pushback from people who maybe initially were sort of part of that stuff to begin with, and now are kind of recognizing the pitfalls. But anyway, to not get too far away from the main points, those are the sort of 2 that come to mind is, just the concept of a cue, or like a biomechanical principle like shoulder retraction pairs with upper arm extension. And for the listener, those words basically just mean your shoulder blade moves back as your upper arm moves back, and then vice versa when you press forward. That's one, sort of quintessential example. And then the second thing would just be the stability conundrum, where, you only really need an exercise to be as stable as you need, which in most cases is kind of like, what does that even mean? It's abstract. It basically just means like, you're moving the bones that you want to move, and you are not moving the bones that you don't want to move. And as long as that is occurring, then thumbs up, go ahead and load it. And if it ever eventually does become a problem, guess what? Then you can problem solve for it. But until it's a problem, I think you're best off just kind of waiting around and just progressing until that actually happens.
I really love those examples. And yeah, one of similar to the stability thing is, again, something that was in vogue was like full range of motion. It's almost like people taking lifts to the fullest range of motion they possibly could for an exercise. I don't know, squatting as deep as possible, like arse to grass type of thing. And they're getting into like huge butt wink, and their hips are really traveling back. They're not really training their quads that well. And it's just like, it just looks like a complete mess. It's like if you go too far in any extreme, like you said, with stability, you start taking away from other key variables for hypertrophy. And I think it always comes back to trying like, what's the bigger picture here? What are we trying to achieve? I was thinking about it, like exercises like top trumps, they've all got like pluses and minuses. There's like a good set of like really good ones. Don't get too obsessed about trying to find the perfect like silver bullet, as it were. Very well described there. If there's anyone listening who like they just want to kind of go into the gym and just lift, like I'm sure you have many people like that. Do you have any way of like creating buy-in for that individual to take biomechanics a bit more seriously?
This will relate to our earlier conversation, Steve, about kind of pain points and like selfishness. I think people generally only do things when they really sense enough pain to need to do that thing. And or they are kind of suddenly inspired by having learned something new. And maybe that just the learning in it of itself is interesting. So some people, they're just into biomechanics. They just love to learn about the topic. They find it interesting. Cool. No buy-in necessary. Most of the people who eventually get to a point of buy-in are people who have just banged their head into a wall for long enough, whether it be through not actually growing a muscle group or being in pain for a certain period of time, to where they eventually just say, okay, look, I've tried it my way and it's just not working out. I need to kind of maybe explore some other options. That is the most, I have not been able to find a more reliable solution to that than to just allow people to, do it for themselves, basically. Um, One thing I might mention as an exception is just there are certain people who, like yourself, are probably interested in biomechanics solely as a means to essentially accomplish a different outcome that you care about a lot. So like you probably want to learn about biomechanics because you're a pro bodybuilder, and because you're a pro bodybuilder, you want to place the highest, you want to grow the most, right? Amongst maybe other things, it's probably intellectually stimulating on some level for you, I would assume. But it's always like in service of another thing, unless it's like the main thing. And for me, it's the main thing, just because again, from the age of 16, I was like wanting to read these anatomy books for whatever reason. But for most people, there needs to be some kind of like actual problem that they're trying to solve, and that they then need to work around. The last thing that I'll say as an example is I have found that it is also helpful to get people to buy into the general topic when it's discussed in tandem with someone that they already trust. So, for example, there are many people in the general sort of, just the average bodybuilding space, the people who are mainly into like classic physique and open physique and untested divisions. Those kinds of people tend to often be on the fence of like, is this topic overhyped? Do I even need to care about this? But if I, let's say, make a post with Hunter Labrada, right, like a top 5 or top 10 Olympia guy, or if or if Terrence, Ruffin, reposts something of mine, it's like just having their what I should say, confirmation or just having their representation of agreement with me is enough to just flip most people, if those people are just super loyal to those others. So those are kind of the main avenues. I have done the whole like trying to explain it to people why it matters. There are just some people who that will never really reach unless there's another sort of motivating factor, whether it be in someone, coming from someone they already trust, or they themselves are experiencing a problem that they then need to kind of try to problem solve for with biomechanics.
Yeah, makes sense. Actually, like you said, thinking back to your initial, like finding it interesting because the anatomy textbooks, then your shoulder issues, and then it was like ignited from there. I totally relate to that.
Exactly.
And it's like that scenario. You can't force, you can take a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink sort of scenario. So you can present great information, but you can't force people to consume it. And I think the way you're demonstrating it now, making it kind of, I think a lot of the people who just want to go in there and not think and just lift, they are put off by some of the kind of very in-depth biomechanics, probably information put out there by people that don't understand it to the level that you do.
Yeah, can I just say one thing on that? Because
Sure.
I do want to actually answer the question more directly too, is the way that I would explain it to someone who was actually like interested in the answer, which I think that your listeners probably are, is that I very much just look at biomechanics as like anatomy and physics in like a mush mush, a mush mush situation. So, an analogy I'll make here is like to cooking and chefs. Like a chef is only a good chef, to the point where they can understand all the ingredients that they're using, right? So if you get a chef who's trying to make a meal and they don't know what salt tastes like, and they don't know what pepper tastes like, and they don't know how much chicken, they don't even know what chicken is or what macronutrients it has, right? That chef is incapable of actually making a tasty meal, right? And in the same sense, like all the biomechanics concepts, which again to me are just basically just functional anatomy of muscle. Like, what does muscle do? And how does muscle respond to force? That's really as complicated as it needs to be for most people. Um, if I just move my arm like this, Steve, am I doing a biceps or a triceps exercise? Well, it would depend on the force, right? Because this could be a curl, it could be a triceps extension. So it's force and it's muscle and motion. And so in the same sense that like a chef would want to know the ingredients of what they're cooking, you as the lifter, as the coach, you would want to know just the basic ingredients of like what you're cooking with. Now, making a tasty meal is harder than just like sitting on a machine and pulling or pushing on something. But I think you kind of see the analogy there, which is just like, these are just the sort of X's and O's of the gym. And I think people get deterred from it because a lot of people who are in the biomechanics space use very jargony language and just language that is unnecessary and language that, and often just topics that are totally unnecessary to really even talk about, like motor unit recruitment. I don't understand this motor unit recruitment obsession. I can understand it's important on some level, but the difference between knowing about it and not knowing about it practically is what I don't really understand. Maybe someone can enlighten me or to that side of the argument. But um, anyway, the basic premise is just these are the ingredients to training, and to me, that's as complicated as it really needs to be.
Makes so much sense. Yeah, for me, as you said, like I'm a pro bodybuilder trying to be my best. So I kind of see it as an extra kind of notch in my belt of things I can learn to help me be better, but also to apply it to clients and also to sometimes try and navigate information online. You might be able to relate to this, Ben, where, for example, like an incline dumbbell curl, people will quote and say there's no tension at the bottom. But I know from practical experience, I've done dumbbell incline curls. I'm like, I feel tension there. Like if I do it in a certain way, how can I find it hard because I don't know biomechanics well enough, or I didn't, to be able to explain why. And I'm like, oh, inertia. When I learned about that, like you're trying to like resist a force because it's the dumbbell's moving down and trying to move your elbow back, but you're resisting against it. And I'm like, that's how I can and then I can talk to clients about it and how we can maybe make an exercise more productive through manipulating almost the resistance profile through the way that we're behaving with the lift itself. So if people hear that and they're like, oh, that sounds interesting, they're going to love biomechanics and some of your stuff.
Yeah. And that's a great example. There are also many other examples, like for instance, the top of a dumbbell press, right? For example, if you are like a well-trained individual, you can get to the top and you can kind of know like, okay, if I'm using a significant load, like there's still stuff there. Like there's still the whole sort of no tension thing has definitely been a problem, I think, in terms of how much that phrase has been repeated. Um, and while true in some contexts, in contexts like the curl you're describing, like the inertial properties of the dumbbell is one thing, you could simply just stop, a couple degrees shy of like full elbow extension, and you still have what is known as like a moment for elbow flexion or elbow extension, depending on how you look at it. But in the context of like a dumbbell press, number one, most people do not have arms that are perfectly straight with the dumbbell. So the dumbbell in most cases is not actually stacked. Number two, you have like other joints that are involved in the motion that most people don't think about, like your sternoclavicular joint, which is the joint for people listening. Like if you poke your collarbone and then you crawl your finger inward toward your sternum and you kind of like do a forward shrug or like an upward shrug, there's a ton of motion in your clavicle. That's how your shoulder blade actually attaches to your body. So that is a joint that is still substantially loaded in the top of a dumbbell press. And, the pec minor controls that joint. The lower portions of the pec, the middle portions of the pec control that joint. So yeah, just like you said, it's like something that I definitely come to recognize. And this is something that Kasim Hansen, who I know you've talked to a bunch of times, has told me a bunch of on a bunch of different occasions. It's just like the more you learn specifically about biomechanics, the more you recognize that there's always just another variable that you're probably not considering, which is true, I think, in probably any domain. It's just like the more you learning really is ultimately a matter of discovering that next variable that you just weren't considering a moment ago. So when you see people talking in these very reductionistic, sort of oversimplified yet overconfident ways, it lands very poorly for me now. Probably mostly because I see a younger version of myself represented through that person. So what I try to do now is I try to have more empathy for sort of where that person is at. But in other instances, I'm not very forgiving, because at a certain point, it's like, dude, you have hundreds of thousands of people on your platform. You should be more responsible with kind of what you're talking about. So.
For sure. Yeah, definitely interesting stuff. And I've really enjoyed this chat, Ben. And like I said, I've been consuming a fair amount of your content over the last like years and months, and I've really enjoyed it. And hopefully people, and I know people will have enjoyed this chat. I've actually had your name come up a number of times of people like, hey, you should get Ben on. So you are in demand. That shouldn't come as a surprise, hopefully, to you. And if people want to learn more from you, Ben, if they aren't already consuming your stuff, anything like that, where should they head?
If you are like a more of a bite-sized consumer, Instagram would be the place. Ben, just my name, Ben Giannis, which most people think it's Yanes, actually. It's actually Giannis.
I inappropriately thought that for a time.
Oh, you did? Well, no,
Yeah.
I would say it's appropriate unless you hear me say it. I would say it's appropriate to assume that.
I heard it on a podcast somewhere, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And then the longer form stuff I've been doing more of on YouTube. So you can just YouTube my name as well. And if you're more of a longer form consumer, I would head there instead. But yeah, I just want to thank you, Steve, for having me on. As I said to you before, I've been a long time listener. I have friends that are longtime listeners, and we all really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I think that you set a really, really awesome example of like what it is like to be a lifelong learner and to kind of sit in the seat that you're in. I know that you probably have many opinions, knowledgeable experiences from which to draw. But in the context of these conversations, I think it's important for your audience to recognize just how much you also have to sort of contribute, that you are intentionally sort of holding back from contributing. Because I know you have a lot of personal experience and a lot of client experience as well. So I just wanted to say thanks for the sort of impact you've had on the industry, because I think it's pretty much been only positive. And I think the more and more that you do this podcast, the more the podcast grows, the better off that pretty much everyone will be. So I appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for gassing me up. I appreciate that. And yeah, as you mentioned somewhere, like being a lifelong learner, and I definitely take the kind of position of student in this position. And thankfully, people like yourself, Ben, who have hundreds of thousands of followers, are willing to spend an hour or so of their time with me, and I highly appreciate it. I'll make sure your YouTube, your Instagram is linked below. Just as a side note, Ben didn't mention them, but he has some kind of products you can also purchase that I've just been diving into. I think your beginner's biomechanics course, which I've been enjoying. It's been like, again, you're a good educator. I can tell from the way that you speak through things on that course. And yeah, if people are interested, definitely head there. Otherwise, guys, we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you, Steve.